Sweat trickled down Dr. May Johnson's neck as she sprinted through the marble corridors of the courthouse, her spacesuit still fresh in her mind from the morning's zero-gravity training session. Her heart pounded against her chest as she clutched her briefcase containing classified NASA documents, mission protocols, and the contested parking ticket that had brought her to this mundane place. The irony of her situation made her lips twitch with an almost smile, having navigated spacecraft through the cosmic void, but somehow finding herself entangled in earthly bureaucracy. The courthouse security guard did a double take as she rushed through the metal detector, her NASA-issued watch triggering a series of urgent beeps. She could have smiled at his confusion, but time was pressing down on her like the G-forces she was so familiar with during launch. The young guard fumbled with her credentials, his eyes widening slightly as he processed the weight of the identification in his hands. But Dr. Johnson was already moving forward, her mind simultaneously tracking the time remaining until her next mission briefing and calculating the fastest route to Courtroom 7B. The ancient elevator groaned as she ascended to the third floor, her fingers absently tracing the small scar on her right hand from her first spacewalk repair mission. The memory of floating above Earth still sent shivers down her spine even after all these years, the same sensation now mixed with an undercurrent of frustration at having to deal with such a trivial matter when she should be preparing for her next mission to test the new Mars orbital insertion protocols. As she slipped into Courtroom 7B, the familiar scent of old wood polish and dusty law books filled her nostrils. The room was half full of traffic offenders, shifting uncomfortably in their seats, while a bored-looking bailiff stood guard by the judge's bench. Dr. Johnson found a seat in the third row, her perfect posture a testament to years of military and astronaut training. She observed the proceedings with the same analytical mind that had earned her 3 doctorates and 14 patents. The afternoon sun filtered through the dusty windows, casting long shadows across the worn floor as she waited for her case to be called. Her NASA credentials remained tucked away in her briefcase, a deliberate choice she had made that morning, wanting no special treatment despite her accomplishments. The weight of her responsibilities pressed against her mind like the pressure of a spacesuit during EVA procedures. Tomorrow, she would be back in the simulator preparing for the most ambitious mission of her career, but today she was just another citizen in a courtroom. Whispered conversations floated around her as other defendants discussed their cases, but Dr. Johnson remained focused, her mind drifting between the technical specifications she needed to review for the new lunar landing module and the absurdity of her current situation. She had managed the complex docking procedures with the International Space Station 3 times, but here she was prepared to debate the validity of a parking ticket in a downtown science center where she had been inspiring the next generation of young minds to reach for the stars. A young mother sitting next to her bounced a fussy baby on her knee, the infant's cries echoing through the high-ceilinged room. Dr. Johnson allowed herself a brief moment to remember the classroom of wide-eyed students she had been speaking to when the parking violation occurred, their faces lighting up as she described the view of sunrise from orbit, their questions about living in zero gravity, and their dreams of following in her footsteps, making the whole situation worth the current inconvenience. The wall clock ticked steadily forward, its rhythm matching the precision timing she relied on during mission-critical operations. She had exactly 47 minutes until her next briefing at the Space Center, where she would review the emergency protocols for the upcoming Mars orbital testing. Her fingers unconsciously tapped out the sequence for initiating the backup life support systems, a procedure she could perform in her sleep after countless hours of training and 3 successful space missions. The courtroom doors swung open, admitting a harried-looking clerk carrying a stack of files that threatened to topple from her arms. Dr. Johnson watched with the same careful attention she gave to monitoring flight trajectories, noting how the young woman sorted and distributed the documents with practiced efficiency. In less than 24 hours, she would be back in her element, surrounded by the cutting-edge technology and brilliant minds at NASA. But for now, she sat quietly, her very presence in this mundane setting a testament to the unpredictable nature of life, even for someone who had touched the stars. Judge William Harrison drummed his fingers against his mahogany bench the same way he had done for the past 15 years in Courtroom 7B, the familiar motion wearing a subtle indentation in the polished wood that matched the growing wrinkles on his aging hands. His steel-rimmed glasses reflected the harsh fluorescent lights as he dispatched justice like a bored king on his throne, surveying his domain with practiced indifference. The morning newspapers lay scattered across his desk, headlines about space exploration and scientific breakthroughs that he had barely skimmed, choosing instead to focus on the local crime reports. His chambers had grown stuffy despite the ancient air conditioning unit rattling away in the corner, its wheezing sounds mixing with the shuffling of papers and quiet murmurs of the courtroom, the same sounds that had accompanied his rise through the ranks of the judiciary system, each promotion reinforcing his belief in the rigid structure of society and his place at its apex. Today was just another day of maintaining order in his district, another parade of faces he would forget as soon as they left his courtroom. The morning session had dragged on with its usual mix of traffic violations and minor infractions, each case blending into the next like watercolors in the rain. Judge Harrison adjusted his robes, a gesture that had become almost theatrical over the years, designed to remind everyone present of his authority and position. The heavy black fabric settled around his shoulders like armor, protecting him from the chaos of the world beyond his bench, a world that seemed to grow more complicated with each passing year. His eyes swept across the afternoon docket, scanning the names and violations with practiced efficiency, until they landed on the next case, his lips curling into a familiar smirk as he spotted the defendant approaching the podium, a black woman in a simple blazer who clearly didn't belong in his upper-class district. Her presence here was just another example of the sort of people who had been infiltrating his jurisdiction lately, bringing their problems and disrupting the careful order he had maintained for so long. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across his face as he prepared to deliver one of his signature lectures, the kind that had earned him a reputation among his peers for being tough on minor infractions. His clerk, Patricia Reynolds, arranged the case files with mechanical precision, her movements as predictable as the sunrise. She had worked for him long enough to anticipate his moods, and this particular case seemed like an easy mark in his mission to clean up the streets, one parking ticket at a time. Behind his stern expression, Judge Harrison felt the familiar surge of satisfaction that came with maintaining what he viewed as proper social order, his mind already composing the speech he would deliver about respect for law and the importance of knowing one's place in society, the same speech he had refined over countless similar cases, his fingers now wrapped around his gavel, the smooth wood, giving him a sense of control and authority that he had come to depend on like a daily meditation. The defendant's composure irritated him, somehow her calm professional demeanor seeming almost defiant in its dignity. The courtroom temperature seemed to drop a few degrees as she stood before him, her presence commanding more attention than he was comfortable with. Even the usual background noise of shuffling papers and whispered conversations had died down, creating an unusual tension in the air that he couldn't quite explain. Judge Harrison leaned forward slightly, his chair creaking beneath his weight as he prepared to begin the proceedings, his voice already taking on the condescending tone that had become his trademark. In cases like this one, the morning light streaming through the high windows created a halo effect around his silver hair, adding to the sense of authority he had cultivated so carefully over the years. Yet something about this particular defendant made him unconsciously adjust his glasses, a nervous habit he thought he had abandoned years ago. The case file lay open before him, a simple parking violation at the downtown science center, the kind of case he could handle in his sleep. But as he began to speak, the words felt different, somehow as if they were echoing back at him in an unfamiliar way. The courtroom air grew heavier with anticipation, while outside his window a flock of birds soared past their freedom, mocking the stuffiness of his domain where he sat perched on his bench, preparing to dispense his particular brand of justice, unaware that his carefully maintained world was about to shift beneath his feet. The ancient radiator clanked ominously in the corner of courtroom 7B, its rhythmic sounds reminiscent of the mechanical symphony Dr. Johnson was accustomed to hearing aboard the International Space Station. She approached the podium with measured steps, her mind simultaneously calculating thrust vectors and orbital mechanics. Even as the judge's voice droned through the stuffy air, her training had taught her to maintain multiple awareness tracks at once, a skill that now seemed almost comical in its application to this terrestrial situation. Officer James Riley stood at attention near the courtroom entrance, his rookie badge still gleaming with newness as he studied the defendant. Something about her bearing triggered a memory in his mind, the same poised confidence he had seen on the inspirational poster hanging in his daughter's bedroom, the one showing the first black woman to pilot a solo mission to repair the Hubble telescope. His eyes darted between Dr. Johnson and the small phone in his palm, where he discreetly began searching for confirmation of his suspicion. The morning sunlight streaming through the tall windows cast elongated shadows across the worn carpet as Judge Harrison launched into his rehearsed speech about common criminals and social order, his words floating through the air like debris in zero gravity, each syllable weighted with assumptions that had accumulated over his years on the bench. Dar Johnson stood perfectly still, her posture forged through thousands of hours in simulators and real space missions where the slightest movement could mean the difference between life and death. Whispers rustled through the gallery like autumn leaves as the judge continued his lecture, his voice rising and falling in practiced cadence, unaware that the woman before him had commanded spacecraft worth billions of dollars and made decisions that affected international space programs. Dar Johnson mentally reviewed the 47 emergency procedures she had memorized for her upcoming Mars orbital testing mission, each protocol more complex than the entire traffic code she was currently being accused of violating. The courtroom clerk Monica Stevens found her attention drawn to the defendant. Something in the way Dar Johnson carried herself seemed to defy the usual demeanor of traffic violators, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. As she realized she had stopped typing the judge's words, her eyes fixed on the subtle NASA insignia barely visible on the corner of a document protruding from the defendant's briefcase, the same logo she had seen in news coverage of recent space achievements. Judge Harrison's voice echoed off the wood-paneled walls, his words about respect for law enforcement and civic duty seeming somehow hollow in the face of Dar Johnson's quiet dignity. She stood at parade rest, a position ingrained through years of military service before her NASA career, her mind light years away from this municipal courtroom as she contemplated the complex calculations required for her next mission while tolerating the judge's increasingly theatrical performance. A young law student sitting in the back row scribbled furiously in his notebook, not recording the judge's words but sketching the scene before him, sensing somehow that he was witnessing something significant, the contrast between the pompous judge and the composed defendant creating a tableau that seemed destined for future legal textbooks discussing bias and presumption in the justice system. The air in the courtroom grew thicker with unspoken tension as more observers began to sense that something was not quite as it appeared. Dr. Johnson shifted slightly, her movement precise and controlled like every action she had learned to execute in the unforgiving environment of space, her fingertips resting lightly on the podium as Judge Harrison reached the crescendo of his speech about accountability and community standards. Behind her, Officer Riley had confirmed his suspicion through a quick internet search, his eyes widening as he scrolled through page after page of Dar Johnson's accomplishments, awards, and groundbreaking missions. The sound of shuffling papers and creaking chairs provided a subtle backdrop to the judge's monologue as Dar Johnson maintained her professional demeanor, her mind now calculating the exact thrust required for orbital insertion around Mars, while simultaneously noting the increasing restlessness in the courtroom gallery, where recognition was slowly beginning to spread like ripples in a zero-gravity water experiment she had conducted on her last space mission. Dust motes danced in the slanting sunlight between the judge and defendant, creating an almost visible barrier between two worlds, one bound by earthly prejudices and the other free to soar beyond the boundaries of atmosphere and assumption. Judge Harrison remained oblivious to the shifting atmosphere in his courtroom as he prepared to pronounce his judgment, unaware that his small-minded lecture was about to collide spectacularly with the reality of the accomplished astronaut standing before his bench. Thunder rumbled outside the courthouse windows, its deep resonance reminding Dar Johnson of the launch sequence vibrations she had experienced 3 times before as Judge Harrison waved away her explanation about the emergency STEM presentation, his voice dripping with condescension, while she mentally reviewed the 47 emergency procedures she'd memorized for her upcoming Mars orbital testing mission. The irony of her situation struck her with the same force as atmospheric re-entry. Here, she was being lectured about responsibility by someone who had never experienced the weight of actual life or death decisions. Memories flickered through her mind like status lights on a command console, childhood dreams of touching the stars, the countless nights spent studying orbital mechanics, the harsh resistance she had faced as both a woman and a person of color in the space program. Each challenge she had overcome now seemed to pale in comparison to the simple act of maintaining her composure in this stuffy courtroom. While a small-minded judge dismissed her existence with casual prejudice, her calloused astronaut hands pressed against the worn wood of the podium, leaving imperceptible impressions like the marks she had left on history. The afternoon light filtered through gathering storm clouds, casting shifting shadows across the courtroom floor like the ever-changing patterns of Earth. she had observed from the cupola of the International Space Station. Dar Johnson stood unflinching as Judge Harrison continued his tirade, her mind simultaneously tracking the local weather patterns through the windows and calculating the probable impact of the approaching storm front on the afternoon's scheduled flight simulator session at the Space Center. Her ability to process multiple complex scenarios at once had saved lives during critical space missions, but now it served to help her endure this bureaucratic ordeal. Whispers continued to ripple through the gallery like solar winds, disturbing the charged particles in Earth's magnetosphere as more observers began to recognize the accomplished astronaut in their midst. A young girl sitting with her mother in the back row clutched a science textbook that ironically featured Dar Johnson's image in the chapter about space exploration, her eyes growing wide with recognition, while the judge remained oblivious to the growing current of awareness flowing through his courtroom. Dar Johnson adjusted her stance slightly, the same subtle movement she used to maintain balance during zero-gravity operations, her NASA training evident in every controlled gesture. As she listened to Judge Harrison's lecture about civic responsibility and proper behavior in civilized society, the words washed over her like cosmic radiation deflected by the thick shields of accomplishment and self-assurance she had built through years of groundbreaking achievements in space exploration. Behind her, several law clerks had begun frantically searching their phones, their expressions changing from boredom to amazement as they discovered exactly who stood before their bench. The storm outside grew closer, its approaching darkness visible through the tall courthouse windows matching the growing tension in the courtroom. Dar Johnson thought about the countless hours she had spent in the neutral buoyancy lab preparing for spacewalks, how she had learned to maintain perfect calm in the face of potentially catastrophic situations. She drew on that same inner strength now as Judge Harrison patronizingly explained the importance of following simple parking regulations to someone who had manually docked with the International Space Station and repaired billion-dollar satellites with nothing but space between her and the infinite void. Scattered papers rustled nervously as a particularly loud thunderclap shook the old courthouse windows, Dar Johnson's mind automatically calculating the storm's distance using the same mathematical precision she applied to orbital trajectories. The young bailiff standing near the judge's bench had pulled out his phone, discreetly scanning news articles, his eyes growing wider with each swipe, while Judge Harrison remained ensconced in his bubble of authority, completely unaware of the gathering storm of revelation about to break over his courtroom. The air grew heavier with anticipation matching the approaching mother system as Dar Johnson stood calmly at the podium, her presence increasingly impossible to ignore. Despite her deliberate attempts to maintain a low profile, she had faced the vacuum of space, coordinated international crews through critical missions, and pushed the boundaries of human exploration. But here in this mundane courtroom, she found herself confronting a different kind of challenge, the deep-rooted prejudices that remained firmly planted on Earth even as humanity reached for the stars. Lightning illuminated the high windows, casting dramatic shadows across the courtroom as the prosecutor Timothy Matthews fumbled with photographs of her car, his confidence wavering as he noticed the Presidential Medal of Freedom partially visible in Dar Johnson's open briefcase. The medal caught the flash of lightning, its gold surface reflecting briefly like a distant star in the cosmic dark of the courtroom. The young prosecutor had handled hundreds of parking violations before, but something about this case felt different, as if he were suddenly performing a routine task in front of an unexpected audience. The evidence photos trembled slightly in Matthew's hands as he held them up, his voice losing its usual authoritative tone as he described the violation scene outside the downtown Science Center, where Dar Johnson had parked while inspiring a group of underprivileged students about careers in aerospace. The timing of her alleged violation coincided perfectly with the moment she had been demonstrating orbital mechanics using a makeshift model of the solar system to a room full of wide-eyed middle school students who had never dreamed space could be within their reach. Another flash of lightning threw the courtroom into stark relief as Dar Johnson stood unflinching, her mind drifting to the moment she had looked down at Earth from space, seeing no borders, no prejudice, just one unified planet spinning in the cosmic dark. That perspective had changed her forever, making these earthbound proceedings seem almost comically insignificant compared to the vast challenges she had faced in the thermosphere. She remembered the feeling of floating above it all, watching political conflicts and social divisions disappear beneath the overwhelming beauty of our shared world. The prosecutor's papers rustled nervously as he continued his presentation, interrupted by the increasingly frequent thunderclaps that seemed to punctuate his words like cosmic exclamation points behind him. The gallery had grown unusually quiet as more observers connected the dots between the composed defendant and the groundbreaking astronaut whose achievements had recently dominated national news. Dar Johnson maintained her professional demeanor, the same calm she had exhibited during the emergency repair of the space station's solar arrays while floating in the absolute void of space. A junior clerk trying to organize the case files accidentally knocked over Dar Johnson's briefcase, spilling its contents across the polished floor of the courtroom. Among the scattered papers lay her official NASA credentials, several scientific journals featuring her research on zero-gravity crystallization, and a recent invitation to speak at the United Nations about the future of international space exploration. A clerk froze in mid-motion, his eyes widening as he realized the magnitude of his accident and the identity of the woman whose belongings he had just scattered. Matthews stopped mid-sentence as his gaze fell upon a newspaper clipping that had fluttered from the briefcase, its headline announcing Dr. May Johnson's historic appointment as mission commander for the upcoming Mars Orbital project. The same woman he had been confidently prosecuting for a minor parking violation now stood before him, her achievements literally scattered at his feet, while outside the storm raged with increasing intensity, matching the growing tension in the courtroom. Dar Johnson moved to help collect her papers, her actions deliberate and precise, like every movement she had learned to execute in the unforgiving environment of space. As she bent down, a small pin on her lapel caught the light, a subtle NASA insignia that had gone unnoticed until now, but suddenly seemed to command the attention of everyone in the vicinity. The prosecutor swallowed hard, his rehearsed arguments about civic responsibility seeming hollow in the face of someone who had repeatedly risked her life for the advancement of human knowledge. Thunder rolled overhead as Matthews attempted to regain his composure, but the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted irrevocably, like the moment of gravitational escape velocity when a spacecraft breaks free from Earth's hold. The photographs in his hands now seemed to tell a different story, not of a careless citizen disregarding local ordinances, but of a dedicated scientist and explorer taking time from her crucial mission preparations to inspire the next generation of space pioneers. The storm outside reached its crescendo as the last of Dar Johnson's papers were gathered, her countless awards and accomplishments now impossible to ignore lying in plain sight before the entire courtroom. The prosecutor stood frozen between protocol and awareness, his carefully prepared case crumbling like a rocket on a failed launch, while Dar Johnson remained composed, her expression reflecting the same steady determination that had carried her through the most challenging moments of her extraordinary career. A heavy silence fell over Courtroom 7B as Judge Harrison announced the excessive fine, his voice carrying an edge of dismissiveness that made several observers shift uncomfortably in their seats. The amount, he declared, was nearly triple the standard penalty for a parking violation, his tone dripping with the same authority he had wielded unchallenged for 15 years on the bench, unaware that his small kingdom of municipal power was about to collide with the infinite expanse of human achievement that stood before him. The young journalist Marcus Chen sat in the back row, his fingers flying across his laptop keyboard. As the story began to take shape in his mind, the decorated astronaut being dressed down by an ignorant judge who had failed to recognize that the woman he was lecturing had literally touched the stars. Chen had covered NASA launches before, but this story promised something different, a stark illustration of prejudice colliding with excellence in the most mundane of settings. His social media followers were already beginning to multiply as word of the unfolding drama spread beyond the courthouse walls. Dar Johnson remained stoic, her expression as calm as when she had navigated her spacecraft through a dangerous meteor shower during her second mission to the International Space Station, her mind automatically calculating the financial penalty in terms of the multi-million-dollar equipment she regularly handled in space. The irony of being fined for parking while conducting a STEM outreach session was not lost on her, especially considering she had been explaining orbital parking procedures to young students at the time of the alleged violation. Whispers erupted through the gallery like a cascade of mission control communications as Judge Harrison's excessive punishment registered with the growing number of observers who had recognized Dar Johnson. Court officers struggled to maintain order as phones lit up throughout the room, their screens displaying news articles and video clips of the accomplished astronaut who stood dignified before the bench, while the judge continued his speech, seemingly oblivious to the rising tide of recognition sweeping through his courtroom. Patricia Reynolds, the longtime court clerk who had served under Judge Harrison for a decade, felt her chest tighten as she noticed the NASA patch on one of the documents that had fallen from Dar Johnson's briefcase, her fingers trembling slightly as she began to understand the magnitude of the situation unfolding before her. She had witnessed countless examples of the judge's prejudices over the years, but this particular instance promised consequences that would extend far beyond their usual municipal jurisdiction. Lightning flashed outside the windows, illuminating the judge's stern face as he continued to lecture about civic responsibility and proper behavior, his words echoing hollowly in the increasingly charged atmosphere of the courtroom. Dar Johnson stood at parade rest, her military training evident in her bearing, while her numerous academic degrees and scientific achievements hung silently in the air around her like invisible satellites orbiting the truth that was about to crash into the judge's carefully maintained world. The storm outside grew fiercer, its intensity matching the growing tension within the courthouse walls as social media alerts began buzzing on phones throughout the gallery. Chen, the journalist, had already filed his first draft to his editor. The story of accomplished astronaut Dr. May Johnson being subjected to judicial prejudice was spreading across news networks. Faster than a spacecraft achieving escape velocity, Judge Harrison remained cocooned in his authority, completely unaware that his actions were about to make headlines for all the wrong reasons. Dar Johnson's NASA-issued watch silently counted down the minutes until her next mission briefing, its advanced technology a stark contrast to the antiquated courthouse clock that ticked away on the wall behind the judge's bench. She had faced the vacuum of space, conducted crucial experiments in zero gravity, and represented humanity among the stars. But here she stood receiving an unjust penalty from a man whose understanding of the world seemed limited to the boundaries of his own prejudice. Court officers exchanged meaningful glances as they noticed more reporters quietly slipping into the back of the courtroom, drawn by social media alerts about the unfolding situation. The story was gathering momentum like a rocket approaching launch velocity, while Judge Harrison continued his pronouncement, each word adding fuel to what promised to be a spectacular demonstration of justice gone wrong in the age of instant communication and social accountability. The atmosphere in the courtroom crackled with electricity as hushed whispers spread like wildfire through the gathered crowd. Someone in the third row had pulled up Dar Johnson's Wikipedia page, the glow of their phone screen illuminating the faces of nearby observers as they leaned in to read about her 3 honorary doctorates, 14 patents, and the elementary school named after her in Houston. The young clerk nearly dropped her stack of papers as she realized she was witnessing a moment that would soon explode across every social media platform in the country. Marcus Chen, the journalist who had first recognized Dar Johnson, was now live-streaming the proceedings to his news organization's social media feed, his fingers dancing across his phone's keyboard as he detailed the incredible credentials of the woman standing before Judge Harrison. With each new detail he uncovered, the story grew more compelling, her achievements reading like a timeline of human space exploration. First black woman to pilot a solo mission to repair the Hubble telescope, youngest astronaut to command an International Space Station crew, holder of the record for longest continuous spacewalk. The courtroom gallery had transformed into a sea of glowing phones as people searched for information about Dar Johnson, their expressions shifting from curiosity to amazement as they discovered video clips of her spacewalks, interviews about her groundbreaking research in zero-gravity crystallization, and photographs of her receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom for her contributions to space exploration. A law student in the front row was frantically taking notes, recognizing that this moment would likely appear in future textbooks about judicial bias and systemic prejudice. Judge Harrison's voice continued to echo through the chamber as he remained oblivious to the rising tide of recognition sweeping through his domain, but even his court officers had begun stealing glances at their phones during breaks in his speech, their eyes widening as they discovered that the woman their boss was casually dismissing had commanded missions worth billions of dollars and made decisions that affected the future of human space exploration. The bailiff, Robert Turner, remembered his daughter doing a school project about Dar Johnson. Just last month, the poster still hung proudly on their refrigerator at home. Dar Johnson maintained her professional composure as the whispers around her grew louder, her mind already focused on the complex calculations she would need to review for tomorrow's simulation of the Mars orbital insertion. The same calm determination that had served her through countless space emergencies now helped her weather this storm of earthbound prejudice, meeting its force with a quiet dignity that had carried her from a small town in Georgia to the commander's seat of humanity's most advanced spacecraft. A group of law interns huddled in the back corner of the courtroom had discovered footage of Dar Johnson's most recent spacewalk, where she had manually repaired a critical solar array While floating in the infinite void of space, their phones passed from hand to hand as more people gathered to watch the stunning video of her mysterious defendant deftly maneuvering in zero gravity against the backdrop of Earth, floating like a blue marble in the cosmic dark. The contrast between that image and her current situation struck many observers as both profound and profoundly disturbing. Patricia Reynolds, the court clerk who had served Judge Harrison faithfully for over a decade, felt her hands trembling as she read through Dar Johnson's list of accomplishments on her computer screen. The woman standing before them had not only broken through the atmosphere, but through countless barriers of gender and race in her journey to the stars. The clerk thought about her own granddaughter, who dreamed of becoming a scientist and felt a complex mixture of emotions well up in her throat as she watched her boss continue his condescending lecture. The storm outside had begun to ease, but the tension in the courtroom only grew stronger as more details about Dar Johnson emerged through the digital grapevine. Someone had found her recent TED talk about the future of space exploration, where she had discussed the view of Earth from orbit and how it transformed her understanding of human prejudice and division. The irony of her current situation was not lost on the increasingly restless audience, as Judge Harrison remained the only person in the room unaware that he was creating a textbook example of the varied biases she had spoken about. The clerk approached Judge Harrison, discreetly sliding over a printout of Dar Johnson's biography. The color drained from his face as he read about the accomplished astronaut standing before him, his earlier assumptions crumbling like a failed launch sequence as his eyes moved down the page line by line, each achievement landing like a physical blow to his carefully constructed worldview. Commander of 3 space missions, lead scientist on the Mars orbital project, recipient of the Congressional Space Medal of Honor. The weight of his mistake pressed down on him like the crushing force of re-entry. His hands trembled slightly as he reached the section about her educational background: 3 PhDs from MIT, Stanford, and Caltech, a masterwork thesis on advanced propulsion systems that had revolutionized space travel, and 14 patents that had transformed everything from satellite communication to space station life support systems. Judge Harrison felt the cold sweat of realization trickle down his spine as he comprehended that he had just spent the last 20 minutes lecturing someone who had literally advanced human knowledge beyond the boundaries of Earth. The afternoon sun broke through the storm clouds outside, sending shafts of light through the courthouse windows that seemed to illuminate Dar Johnson like spotlights on a stage. While Judge Harrison struggled to maintain his composure behind the bench, his authority suddenly feeling as fragile as a soap bubble in zero gravity. The courtroom had grown eerily quiet, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see how he would handle this astronomical mistake. The same silence that preceded critical moments during space missions, when decisions could mean the difference between triumph and disaster. Memories of his morning newspaper flashed through his mind. The space section he had casually discarded without reading now haunted him as he recognized Dar Johnson's face from the front page article about the upcoming Mars mission. The same woman he had dismissed as just another traffic violator had been featured in a 4-page spread about humanity's next giant leap into the solar system. His judicial robe suddenly felt heavy and constricting, like a spacesuit without proper ventilation, as the full impact of his prejudiced assumptions crashed down around him. Patricia Reynolds, his trusted clerk of 10 years, stood nearby, watching the recognition dawn across his face like a slow sunrise seen from orbit. She had served him through countless cases, but had never seen him quite so shaken. The proud bearing that usually characterized his bench presence seemed to deflate as he continued reading about Dar Johnson's contributions to science, her recent selection to lead the first crewed mission to Mars orbit, and her ongoing work inspiring underprivileged youth to pursue careers in aerospace engineering. The gallery remained hushed but vibrating with tension as observers watched Judge Harrison process the magnitude of his error. Phones continued to light up throughout the courtroom as news of the situation spread across social media platforms, reaching newsrooms and NASA public relations offices faster than radio signals from deep space. The story of judicial prejudice colliding with scientific excellence was too compelling to ignore and too profound in its implications to dismiss. Judge Harrison adjusted his glasses with unsteady fingers, the same nervous gesture he had exhibited during his first day on the bench decades ago, as he reread certain lines of the biography, trying to reconcile the accomplished scientist and explorer described on paper with the woman he had so casually dismissed. His mind struggled to process how someone who had commanded spacecraft worth billions of dollars and made split-second decisions affecting international space missions could be standing in his courtroom accepting his condescension with such dignified patience. The sound of cameras clicking in the back of the courtroom reminded him that this moment would likely become part of his legacy, a cautionary tale about the dangers of assumption and prejudice. The afternoon light caught Dar Johnson's NASA pin, causing it to gleam like a distant star, a silent reminder of how far human achievement could soar beyond the limited horizons of earthbound prejudice. Judge Harrison felt the weight of every eye in the courtroom pressing down on him as he struggled to find words that could possibly address the magnitude of his error. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, awkwardly reassessing the case and reducing the fine to a warning, his voice barely audible in the charged atmosphere of Courtroom 7B as Dar Johnson thanked him professionally and turned to leave her NASA-issued heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown sequence, the sound echoing through the suddenly silent chamber as she gathered her belongings with the same precise movements she used during spacecraft operations, while behind her the judge sat in stunned silence, realizing his small-minded assumptions had just become tomorrow's headline news. Sunlight streamed through the windows, painting golden paths across the courtroom floor as Dar Johnson made her way toward the exit, her path clear as observers respectfully moved aside, many standing in spontaneous recognition of her achievements, the same way Mission Control stood when astronauts returned from successful missions. Her briefcase, now properly closed, containing the classified documents about the upcoming Mars orbital insertion procedures that somehow seemed infinitely more significant than the parking ticket that had brought her here. Marcus Chen, the journalist who had first recognized her, was already uploading his story to his newspaper's website. His headline reading, "Astronaut shows true grace under pressure as judge learns costly lesson about prejudice," the story spreading across social media platforms at speeds that would rival the telecommunications satellites Dar Johnson had helped design and launch during her earlier missions at NASA. Young interns in the gallery watched her departure with a mix of awe and inspiration, several of them already drafting social media posts that would soon transform this mundane traffic court session into a viral moment about prejudice, perseverance, and the triumph of human achievement. Patricia Reynolds, the court clerk, hurried after Dar Johnson, clutching a copy of the dismissal paperwork, but also holding her young daughter's space camp application, the same program Dar Johnson had founded to help underprivileged children pursue careers in aerospace engineering. The astronaut paused briefly to sign the application, adding a personal note about reaching for the stars no matter what obstacles appear in your path, her handwriting steady and clear, just like the trajectory calculations she performed in space. The afternoon sun cast Dar Johnson's shadow long across the courthouse steps as she emerged from the building, checking her advanced chronometer and calculating the remaining time until her next mission briefing at the Space Center, where she would review critical procedures for humanity's next giant leap into the cosmos. Behind her, the story of what had transpired in Courtroom 7B was already spreading through news networks and social media channels, creating ripples of discussion about justice, prejudice, and the unlimited potential of human achievement when free from the gravity of preconception. Officer James Riley stood at attention as she passed, offering a respectful nod, while his daughter waited by the courthouse entrance, clutching her science textbook, the same one that featured Dar Johnson's historic spacewalk on its cover, the young girl beaming with excitement as her hero paused briefly to speak with her about dreams, determination, and the view of Earth from orbit where human divisions disappeared beneath the overwhelming beauty of our shared world, her words carrying the weight of someone who had seen firsthand how small earthly prejudices appeared from the perspective of space. Judge Harrison watched through his chamber's window as Dar Johnson departed the courthouse, his legal pad covered in nervous scribbles as he attempted to draft a formal apology, his carefully maintained worldview shaken by the encounter with someone whose achievements transcended the narrow boundaries of his jurisdiction. In his 15 years on the bench, he had never felt more humbled or more aware of the limitations of his own perspective as he watched her disappear into the crowd below, his mind already dreading the inevitable media coverage that would follow. Dar Johnson stepped into her waiting vehicle, her mind already shifting back to the complex calculations and procedures required for the upcoming Mars mission. The afternoon in traffic court becoming just another example of the earthbound challenges she had overcome on her journey to the stars. Her NASA communication device buzzed with messages from Mission Control requesting her input on critical orbital trajectories, but she allowed herself a small smile thinking about the young girl she had just met, hoping that someday these small moments of prejudice would be remembered only as stepping stones on humanity's path to the stars.